Hi there, and welcome to our next discussion in the Guidehouse webinar series, Pathways to Resilience, Infrastructure 4.0. My name is Christine Richards, and I'm with Guidehouse, and I'm excited to be your host today. So today's topic, we're going to dive into e-mobility resilience. And even with the pandemic that we're experiencing right now, the ultimate goal of building a more sustainable and resilient transportation system is still there. But we're really finding that the pathways to get there have almost certainly changed. So today we're going to take some time to talk about what the future looks like, and then ultimately, how those paths may be redefined as we head towards that future. Now, before we get into today's topic, I just want to talk a little bit about Guidehouse and our energy, sustainability, and infrastructure segment. We're a team of about 700 people who really focus on helping a lot of different organizations build more sustainable and resilient futures. So we work with a lot of utilities and energy providers. We work with governments as well as large corporations and investors. So a lot of different partners who are responsible for, making more sustainable and resilient communities and infrastructure happen. One thing I do want to point out as well is that a part of the ES&I segment is Guidehouse Insights. And so that is the former Navigant Research Group. So the name has changed, but the team there is still the same. They're still covering a lot of the key topics in the industry and where things are heading. And there's some great ways to connect with us listed on the bottom of the slide here. So you'll see some of our new social media links, so be sure to connect with us. And we look forward to the conversation today. So with that, let's take some time just to meet our panelists. So we have a great team here to discuss e-mobility, and I'm excited to introduce them here for today's call. So first up, we have Dan Hahn. Dan, you're the leader of our global energy providers practice, and you've worked for a couple decades with utility companies, helping them with their transformation journey. Now, I think something that's important to point out is that, consulting, a lot of the job is a lot of travel. How have you been handling the past couple months in terms of kind of just being at home?
Hi, Christine, and thank you for all that have joined this call today. It's very exciting times and a lot of things going on. And with regards to I'm from Chicago. I'm here outside the Chicago area. And the past, I'm trying to remember the last time I was on a plane. I think the week of the 3rd of March, and it's been different. I do think that with the work that we do and our ability to engage virtually like this has been really helpful. And whether it's talking to our clients or whether it's talking to our own people, as well as other stakeholders, the adaptation of working from home and working from your home office is quite the norm now. And it's definitely a change. I think in the month of March there was a curve of understanding kind of how to do this, and now it's pretty commonplace.
Yeah. Well, definitely great to have you here. I mean, what do you want people to get out of the conversation today? What are some of the things that you think are really critical?
When I think about what the pandemic has done to all parts of society, and when we think about as the title infers, right, in regards to pathways to resiliency, the importance of e-mobility, how we look at sustainability is still very important. And I think even with this challenge we're facing today, I hope the audience today gets some insight in regards to how we believe, and based on our research that the team and the insights that we've generated, how this is still very much an important topic that is in front of us.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's great to have you here today, Dan. Next up is Derek Jones, who is the head of our mobility practice here at Guidehouse. And Derek, you recently did a video on LinkedIn, talking about the future of mobility and answering, different questions around that. And I saw that, some of the biggest comments you got were around your new stellar haircut. So who's responsible for that haircut?
That's a great question, Christine. I really appreciate the personal note in that question. So echoing Dan's comments, welcoming everyone to the webinar. Look forward to an exciting conversation here. I call her the littlest barber in Berkeley. My 10-year-old was responsible for pulling off the haircut. Was fortunate enough to get our hands on a haircut kit, and creativity is big at our house. So in any mode, whatever form it takes, even if it's shearing hair, we're open to it. So I think she pulled it off. Actually, I scheduled her for Saturday as well. So
Nice. Nice. Well, good. Well, I'm glad there's a lot of innovation and creativity going on. Now, what are some of the things you want people to keep in mind today as we talk about mobility and where it's going?
I think change, and I talked a bit about this in that video spot, guerrilla video spot, as we call that, for the Ask Me Anything. And it's that, with the intersection already fully underway between, as we're talking about the electric grid and transportation, that since that at that intersection, the merge has happened between the industries, and it's going to be thinking carefully about how the players that have made that merge start to pivot between the different changes, right, in the road ahead, and whether that's an increased focus in things like logistics and how that type of transportation is going to continue to electrify to satisfy a number of different goals, cost saving, sustainability goals, and others that folks are interested and focused on, and having that really bolster the road forward, as opposed to some lighter spots in the market that we might see ahead, for example, on the passenger vehicle side, where folks are moving less for social and work reasons as well. As Sam pointed out well in a recent report that I suspect he'll mention as we go through today. So change is coming, and being flexible and pivoting quickly is going to be important in this space.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's great to have you here, Derek. And last but not least, we have Sam. Sam, I'm very curious about your background. Where are you reporting in from today?
Well, I'm sitting in my home in Ypsilanti, Michigan, but the background is beach in Carmel, California, that where my wife and I had a little trip a few years back. And so I wanted, since it's so gray and rainy for the last several days here, I wanted something a little more cheery behind me.
Yeah, I love the inspirational background for sure. So Sam, I mean, just to kick things off, how are you feeling about the future of mobility right now? Given the dramatic changes that we're experiencing.
Well, I've worked in and around the auto industry for 30 years as an engineer, as a journalist, and now as an analyst. And the last several years, we've seen more change than at any time in my career, and it's really just beginning. Coming into 2020, the auto industry was facing, the biggest challenges in its entire history, in its 130 plus year history, particularly around automation and electrification, but also a shift in business model towards shared services. And what's happening right now is really in a lot of ways upending a lot of those plans. Some things are going to get strengthened. Some things are probably going to get pushed back a little further out in time. But we're definitely going to see a lot more changes going forward.
Yeah. So I mean, that change is coming. So yeah, definitely. How do you start to prepare for that? So we'll get into that today. We're going to take some time to talk about how this future of mobility may look and how it may change given the current situation that's going on. And then we're going to talk about those pathways. How do we start moving forward and really start embracing the future? But before we do that, we want to hear from all of you. So a great way to engage with us is to ask questions in the chat box. So we definitely encourage you to do that. But we want to kick things off here by just doing a few quick polls with you all. One is to really get your familiarity and experience with electric vehicles. And then we want to talk about your perspectives about how your use of different transportation modes has changed. So let's go ahead and dive into those polls. All right, and I see some of you have already responded. So, our first poll is really looking at how have you engaged with electric vehicles? So maybe you've just seen one, maybe you've ridden in one, maybe you own one. We'd love to see how you've engaged with electric vehicles. So take a moment, that poll is in the chat box. And Derek, I know that you've asked this question a lot of different people. What have you seen in terms of some of the trends in terms of how people have experienced electric vehicles and are engaging with them?
Well, I'd say a few years ago, it was pretty rare that folks had had the chance to do what we call, getting cheeks and seats. So getting into a ride and drive that might be offered by an automaker or a local organization. But over the last, I'd say last time I've done this, and typically it's, we're in person, so it's a show of hands in the crowd. But typically about 50% now have at least ridden in or driven one. So we're starting to see that pop up in the poll here. Recommend folks keep responding to keep up with my commitment here of 50%. But yeah, this is starting to track with what we're typically seeing, which is great. Getting awareness is important for obviously unlocking demand.
Okay. All right. Well, now that you said that, at least well, it's looking like it's starting to line up. There are actually a fair number of people who own one. I'm assuming you all have ridden in one, right? Or
Oh yeah,
yes,
many
Yes,
of them.
okay. Do any of you have one?
I don't. I get a chance to drive quite a few of them. In my role as an analyst, I'm fortunate to have the opportunity to drive vehicles from a number of different manufacturers and evaluate them. And so I've driven most of the EVs that are on the market today, and there's quite an increasingly wide range of vehicle types and
Yeah.
different price points. So that and it's starting to get to the point where they're becoming affordable as mainstream products.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, good. Well, it looks like a lot of people have at least experienced an EV, and we have several people on the call who own one. So awesome. All right, so let's do the next poll. This is going to talk about some of the shifting perspectives, kind of pre and I guess post COVID-19. So we have a question here around, what's your inclination to use shared mobility after the pandemic? And I know, Sam, you've seen some things around this. What are you thinking in terms of what we'll likely see here?
Yeah, there was actually a survey that was conducted by IBM a couple of weeks ago, a consumer survey, 14,000 Americans, and they asked a similar question to this, looking at people's attitudes towards various modes of mobility in the wake of the pandemic. Looking at car sharing, peer-to-peer car rentals like Turo, ride hailing, public transit, and use of personal vehicles. And about half of all the respondents said that they were more likely to use their personal vehicles or exclusively use their personal vehicles afterwards. And similarly, about half said, for all the various shared modes, that they would use it less or not at all. I think people are really concerned about getting into these spaces where they don't know who else is in there or who's been in there just before them, and when it was last disinfected or cleaned up. So this is an issue that anybody in the shared mobility space is going to have to deal with. And talking to companies over the last several weeks, they are looking at this, trying to find solutions for how to make these shared spaces safer for everyone so that they don't get contaminated.
Yeah, definitely. All right,
And
so we're
Sam, just to build on that a quick second, I know that was already a topic in the automation discussion, right? The shared mobility options and services. So not having a driver or a human supervisor in the car, in the vehicle, was already an issue. So this kind of adds to an already ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and the fact that going from a traditional taxi or ride hail vehicle, where you've got a driver who if there was somebody in the vehicle who might have been sick or was showing some symptoms, they might, after the passenger gets out, they could go and wipe down with disinfectant wipes the back seat before another passenger gets in. But if there's no one in the vehicle to do that, no one that's capable of doing that, then now you have to come up with automated methods of doing that.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we're seeing people feeling less inclined, maybe a person or two who's feeling brave, and then a fair number of people say, hey, it's not going to necessarily change significantly. So definitely some interesting results. All right, so we have one more question that we wanted to ask you all. And this is around delivery services. So we wanted to know, what's your inclination to use delivery services after the pandemic. So, you know, I feel like I have boxes arriving every day at my home. Sometimes I lose track of it. Dan, what are you thinking in this space in terms of, you know, delivery services and where people might be going?
This is a pretty interesting phenomenon that I think we're going to see more on the folks on the left side of the picture here are on more inclined. You know, the last mile delivery component of what our daily lives entail and the increased use of delivery services. I mean, you all heard about Uber and its bid for Grubhub, right? You hear about Instacart becoming a much more commonplace item in regards to how folks look at delivery. And then, you know, if you look at transitioning that from into the actual autonomous as well as electrification space and how a lot of these, you know, you hear about the Amazons and the UPSs of the world getting more electrical fleets. The commercial side of business, in my opinion, is going to be something that we all are going to see increase and offset the actual, you know, consumer, you know, the end consumer side of things as well, right? So, you know, for those of us that travel, whether it's for business or for pleasure, and how we all get to sit on a plane or how we all get to sit on a, you know, there are probably folks on this phone here that come from places that use commuter trains a lot. In regards to, I sure take it downtown from where I live. You know, how that all changes in regards to the space that we all are anticipating to keep, you know, some degree of distancing, and the lack, you know, the lack of use in there, or the less of use is going to get offset by the commercial side. And that to me is actually an interesting area where not only is it the delivery services, but also other businesses and the changing business models that we're going to see coming out of this is going to be very interesting for us. On top of everything else that's going on, you're going to see changes in my mind around the medical services industry in regards to how things are done there. You know, the automation that you potentially could see in regards to how deliveries are made. So this is to me a unique outcome of what's happening as part of the pandemic.
Yeah. And anything you want to add there, Sam or Derek, around what we're seeing here on this poll?
Yeah, you know, we've already seen just in the last week or so, you know, a number of large companies that have had their employees working from home over the past couple of months have made announcements that even as, you know, some states are starting to open up their economies again, they're going to continue to have many of their employees continue to work from home. Google and Facebook both announced that they're extending work from home policies through the end of the year. And Twitter and most recently Square have announced that they're making their work from home policies permanent for any employees that are able to work from home. If they wish to continue doing that, they are going to be able to do that even after the pandemic subsides. So, you know, we expect that some portion of the workforce that doesn't have to be in a particular location will continue to work remotely on a permanent basis, and that's going to have cascading effects throughout the economy. You know, if people are, you know, if you have, you know, say 10, 15, 20% of the workforce that is able to work from home continuing to do that, that's going to be fewer vehicle miles traveled. That's going to put less wear and tear on vehicles, so stretch out the replacement cycles. It's going to put less demand on various modes of transit, whether it's public transit or ride hailing or micromobility services. But at the same time, those people that are working remotely are probably going to be relying more on deliveries. And so options for deliveries, and we're seeing companies that are in the automated vehicle space shifting their emphasis towards deliveries, goods delivery, and away from robotaxis as a potential pathway to getting this technology deployed.
Yeah, definitely. So there's changing patterns and how people are in you know, engaging with their communities. You know, if they're traveling through them or getting things, you know, delivered. I think this has been a really interesting contrast to see in this poll, where yeah, I mean, people are looking at shared mobility differently. They may be less inclined to use it, but then they're looking, you know, they have a greater inclination to use delivery services. So, you know, there are those challenges that are being created, but also those opportunities that are coming about because of this. All right. Let's dive into a little bit deeper discussion. Now, we really wanted to talk about the future of mobility first, and how we see that shaping up. And I just have one more slide here to share, and this is from a recent Guidehouse Insights research report, just showing the impact of COVID-19 on some of the alternative fuel vehicles. So Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about this this graph, because you worked on it along, I think, with Scott Shepard on this report?
Yeah, so a couple of months ago, as the shutdowns were starting to spread beyond China, as things were settling down in China, but North America and Europe and other regions were starting to undergo these stay-at-home policies or lockdowns, we decided to take another look at our vehicle forecasts. And this is one of the things we do at Guidehouse Insights is forecasting vehicle sales. And trying to gauge the impact. And obviously it's very early on to know for sure, but taking a look at some of the patterns that were already starting to change as a result of these shutdowns, we updated our forecasts, and we're projecting, our optimistic projection is that this year light vehicle sales globally are going to drop by probably somewhere around 30% compared to 2019. And it's probably going to take several years, looking out to 2024 timeframe, to start to recover back to the previous trend line. And that also includes the electrified vehicle market. So we do project that electrified vehicles are going to be growing faster than the overall market, which is why you see that trend there. But the green line on there is our revised projection. So we're, compared to 2019, we're projecting sales of electrified vehicles, and this includes hybrids, battery electrics, and fuel cell vehicles, are going to decline by around 5 or 6% from 2019 overall for the year. But compared to what had been projected for 2020 as part of our, that overall growth, we're down about almost 30% compared to where we were projected to be. And we don't see that. While it is going to recover in 2021 and beyond, it's going to take several years to get back. And so that's going to be some lost momentum for electrified vehicles.
Okay. And Derek, how about you? I mean, how are you seeing things? I mean, from the fleet side, you're working with a lot of organizations around that. How is that change? Is that changing at all because of the pandemic in terms of interest in electric vehicles and purchasing them potentially?
Yeah, that's a good next topic to turn to. We haven't seen a decrease in the interest. I think what I'm even more mindful of is certainly a pause, particularly because as we've been working with fleets in different use cases, right? Large corporations, multinational corporations, thinking about the long term. And that's a thread I often draw on, that connection between energy providers and the auto industry is similar in terms of their design and planning timeline. They are always thinking 5 to 7 years out in terms of infrastructure from the utility side, in terms of new builds for the auto industry. So because both have the long term in view, there is a fair amount of consideration, right, to that last poll. So if deliveries are going to go up, and if there are still some very real targets out there, particularly flowing from the Paris agreements around carbon emissions reductions, then what are the levers that large corporations that are looking to achieve those targets and to achieve their sustainability goals, what are the levers that they can pull? Certainly, renewable energy has been the most common lever to pull as organizations are thinking about that, meeting their commitments. But fleet electrification, in terms of supply, certainly that's been constrained up until now, and there's a bit of a pause as folks have been reorienting to demand and to their own internal organizational needs, right? Certainly in the smaller company and smaller fleet divisions, got to think about keeping business as usual going, as usual as you can make it. But towards the long term, how can the grid support this move towards fleet electrification, as these companies and the science-based targets that they're committing to aren't going away, and the levers they have to pull are sort of few and far between. So fleets are there, but as many on this webinar know, supply is an important consideration, and the medium and heavy duty vehicle sectors are going to be important in keeping up with potential demand. So that's one area to watch very closely.
Yeah,
And to add to,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead, Sam.
to add to what Derek was saying, we do see the commercial fleet sector as actually being probably one of the primary drivers of growth for electrification. Because of both the demand for freight and deliveries is not going to go away, and that's going to continue to grow. And those customers, whereas individuals who may be, in an economic downturn are going to be concerned about their ability to make payments on a vehicle. They're going to be less inclined to buy any kind of vehicle. But fleets, they're seeing the benefits of electrification in terms of reduced operating costs, reduced maintenance costs, and they are going to push ahead. They're going to press ahead with electrification on a large scale, and that's actually probably going to have more of a beneficial impact on sustainability than excuse me, than individuals buying those vehicles, because they drive a lot more miles in vehicles that, for combustion engines would be using a lot more fuel. So the real benefits are going to be much more significant from those fleets being electrified.
Mm-hmm. And we touched on that in a recent white paper in terms of what those challenges are, recognizing that demand's likely to continue and certainly increase in the coming years. We partnered with Ceres and the California Trucking Association to complete. Again, Scott Shepard worked on that, and it was funded by Amazon. So folks are very interested in that space. But what that really thinks about is what are things that utilities, policymakers, and regulators can do to think about and address the challenges, which can be very micro, down to the charging session duration and uptime considerations, but also some of these larger state incentives, like here in California, where there have been programs in place for a while, to think not just about the car piece of the equation, and in this case for fleets, right, with the vehicle and class 3 and above, as well as part of class 2 vehicles, but also the infrastructure, where the state has allowed the utilities to fund some very significant make-ready investments to make it easy for these fleet providers to electrify. So big focus there, and that really ties back to the resilience that e-mobility is going to need from the grid and the folks that make it work.
Absolutely. And Dan, what do you want to add around this?
When I hear all the conversation around corporate responsibility, especially with the folks that are on the phone or in this webinar that are from corporations where ESG, environment, social governance, is still very important. Interesting enough, you can look at this pandemic and its impact to jobs, and then number of folks who are unemployed now, at staggering levels. And you think about as a commercial organization, the importance that ESG still plays in the formula to creating shareholder value. I've talked to several CEOs in the past couple of weeks about how even during this time, ESG is still such a huge component. And as we think about, the folks that are making the deliveries, being part of that ecosystem and the role they play, and think about how the electrification component of the decarbonization world is still very much an important thing. We can't put that aside. And I think it's, that momentum will still continue regardless of the situation we're in today. And I think that's something that we challenge ourselves, we challenge the folks we talk with, and think about how can we still put that front and center while we're balancing things like, affordability, right? Our utility clients continue to think about reliability, resiliency, and affordability in this market. So those are the things that I think about and really, want to make sure that we all think about as well, because it's going to be something that won't go away.
And is that, Dan, you work a lot with a lot of different energy providers and utilities. So are you still seeing that momentum at utility companies around electrification for transportation and in e-mobility? How are you seeing things in terms of that momentum?
The clean energy agenda is still very much alive. When you look at, and we just finished earnings seasons, right, for our investor-owned utilities.
Yeah.
That is still very much alive in regards to the longer-term outlook on clean energy across, globally across the world. An interesting, I'll tell a story, right? I mean, we're working with Excel Energy right now. We have a team of folks working with them on the electrification agenda, and Colorado is still, it's a collaboration between the state as well as with Excel on continuing on the value proposition of electrification. And I think that's just an example of the leadership that those two stakeholders are showing in regards to the transition.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely still seeing that momentum. And I live here in Denver, and we've been working with the city of Denver around it. And I mean, even with all the things that are going on, they have a big climate action task force that's still moving ahead, and all of these things, still have to move forward. So definitely seeing things progress. So we talked a little bit about kind of looking at that longer term. Sam, you talked more about this 5 to 7 years out, looking at the changes in EVs, and Derek, you talked about it from the fleet perspective. If we were going to look at what the e-mobility looks like, e-mobility market looks like in the next 5 to 10 years, what are some of the biggest changes we're going to see in terms of that vision? I mean, where will growth happen? What are some of the key things we need to be keeping in mind as we look to that longer term perspective in terms of that vision? Sam, how about you?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, two of the biggest changes that the transportation industry was looking at coming into 2020 were electrification and automation. And right now, because of what's going on with the economic downturn that we're likely to be facing, and just the costs that they've experienced through this shutdown period, everybody's concerned about preserving capital, and so they're having to take a look at what their investment priorities are going to be going forward. And what is being realized is that when it comes to the automation side of it, automated driving, the technology is simply not mature enough yet to the point where we're going to be able to get significant volumes and start to get a real return on that investment in the near term. That's really going to be more mid-decade before that really starts to mature. So what we're seeing is that companies are looking at the electrification side, and they're prioritizing their investment on electrification and moving forward full speed ahead with almost all of their electrified vehicle programs, both for smaller vehicles, but also for larger commercial vehicles. And then they're still continuing with the automation, but that's going to take somewhat of a backseat for the next couple of years. And really the focus there is going to be more on goods delivery than the robo-taxi type of market. So we'll see that continuing press ahead. We're going to see a lot more electrified vehicles coming to market in the next 2-3 years. And in fact, GM just announced last week that they are fully committed to the plan that they announced at the beginning of March as this was all getting going. So we're going to see everybody moving forward with these plans.
Okay, absolutely. And Derek, how about you? I mean, what are some of the biggest changes you're thinking we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the vision?
I think one of the bigger changes, and it ties in obviously to the resiliency side, is thinking about a business model that we talk about in our T2G white paper around load orchestration. So with these vehicles, particularly as we talked about parking lots of batteries in the fleet application, as opposed to the driveway by driveway batteries in the passenger applications, as these parking lots are coming online, and we've seen some very interesting pilots with some good success stories around managed charging for large parking lots of vehicles. How is the grid, and first, from just that engineering problem, right? How is the grid and all the different footprints that the different utilities and their different business models accommodate in coming online? And then how can these resources, as they start to become an increasingly large new load source for those distribution networks, how can they be leveraged as resources to support the ongoing supply and demand as the grid is serving all the other end uses, right? That it's charged with with providing electricity and fuel. So that load orchestration area, I think, is primed probably still for another year or two before we really start to see some significant uptake. But as folks are aware, there's been quite a bit of activity in California and in the Northeast, and some pockets of activity in the Midwest as well to look to in terms of what business models in the private sector and the EV ecosystem can take shape and produce, as well as utilities for managing these programs. We're involved with a few of those and have experimented with some out here on the West Coast as well. So load orchestration is going to be definitely one to watch.
Yeah, definitely. And Dan, how about you? What are you thinking in terms of that future vision and how things might look in 5 to 10 years around mobility?
I do believe that as you saw in the chart shared before, that the trend line and the ongoing trend line out to, let's say, 2025 to 2030 is still something that's very relevant. We will see and anticipate in our research 2 to 3 years of recovery time that's needed. But similar to what Derek shared about the different operating models that we see out there within our transportation to grid white papers that we've created, there is going to be an evolution of, and I mentioned this in the start, is that how will change in regards to this. The outcomes will still be there with regards to whether you're a load orchestrator or what role do you play in that. I do think that those models will evolve, but the premise around them, I think, will stay consistent. There will be a focus on decarbonization. There will be a focus on sustainability. ESG will continue to be very important for the community as well as the shareholders for a lot of these companies. And I think that's going to be where the value is going to manifest itself. In the meantime, between the next couple of years and how this actually impacts it, I mean, I see some of the questions coming in around, what is the oil price going to do to, affordability around, transitioning to electric vehicles. As we as consumers, gosh, I'm trying to remember last time I was at Costco the other day and I saw, this was a month ago, right? Gas was $1.50, $1.25. I haven't seen that in, ages. I can't remember since when. And, that whole affordability factor around what we talked about with unemployment and the folks that are behind, getting support for the stimulus packages, I think that's all going to play into the mindset around this. Plus, we're going to travel less. We're going to actually, as Sam mentioned, the vehicle miles traveled is going to be a lot less than before, to a significant degree where, we see some of these great, I call it the upside of these unintended consequences where, folks in LA can actually see the Hollywood sign, right? And that's going to be something that, all over the world we're seeing the climate change, positive climate change impacts that we're seeing. So with all these things that are happening in this broad ecosystem, to me, that's why it's so exciting. To me, that's why I love what I do, because I get to see this and work with this and work with our clients around it. And, this is uncharted territory, like our title, adequately defines.
Yeah, so still a lot of opportunities to define where things are heading, even though it sounds like, we have some directions that we are heading in. And Sam, do you want to add anything around this or?
Yeah, speaking of kind of uncharted territory, one of the advantages of what's been happening, the industry has been learning over the past 10 years, the first 10 years of this current age of electric vehicles. They've learned a lot of lessons. There were a lot of interesting ideas that came up a decade ago as this was just kicking off around things like vehicle to grid integration and and second life batteries, and none of that really has been able to catch on so far because there just wasn't enough scale. There weren't enough EVs on the road, and certainly enough EVs coming off the road. And there was too much. The industry was too fragmented. Everybody had different types of batteries, different chemistries, different battery formats. And what we're starting to see now is as the number of EVs that are available grows, manufacturers are actually starting to take into account, okay, we're getting to the point where we're actually going to have enough scale to do some other interesting things beyond just the transportation with these batteries. And they're designing into their batteries, how to take into account availability for second life and for vehicle to grid integration. So we're seeing work on bidirectional charging. GM, in its new battery design for its new generation of EVs, they've designed the battery management system to accommodate so that it's reprogrammable, so that you can take modules out of vehicles that have reached end of life and repurpose those for stationary storage applications much more easily than they've been able to do before. So when you combine that along with more fleets going electrified, those fleets are going to be easier to tie in to utilities for vehicle to grid applications, because those are more easily managed than individual owners who may be using their vehicles at any given point in time or in any different location. But with a fleet where you've got a fleet that's more centralized, that's going to be easier to manage that integration. So there's a lot of great opportunities available here as long as all these partners come together and collaborate.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sam, and that's a great point on the technology side. The demonstrations are happening. We're starting to see really these applications, these ideas come to life, and folks making it real. That next phase of commercialization and how to successfully monetize these vehicles in either a managed charging, so the V1G application, or a vehicle to grid application for bidirectional flows. The monetization has been a tricky piece, right? And I think about that, having come, had my foot in both worlds in my career so far. So having worked in the auto industry and having worked in the utility industry before Guidehouse, and recognizing that each has its own dictionary and glossary of terms, right? So making money based on vehicle miles traveled, MPG, as opposed to kilowatt hours, kWh, and kW demand. Very different drivers in how folks are making their money and have been doing so for many, many decades. So how does that translation happen? Back to the intersection I mentioned, as we're thinking about commercializing vehicle to grid applications, managed charging in the load orchestrator business model. And that translation is still kind of happening. There's interpreters in there. We like to play that role between the industries to interpret between the dictionaries. But back to Dan's point about pricing, right? We all know and have our own gauge in our head, as it were, on what I typically need to pay at the pump for a gallon of gas. And I know when it's kind of high, I know when it's kind of low, and I know where to go if I want to save a dime or a nickel. Whereas as automakers and folks looking to commercialize load orchestration look across the national landscape, they don't have those prices sitting on a corner, right, on a pedestal listing what they would need to pay to fuel. They've got tariff sheets and they've got rates and demand charges and a whole lot to interpret. So I think that translation's happening, and that's where I do see, Christine, in 5 to 10 years, that master guidebook is going to come together, and folks are going to be able to move on that commercialization pace. If on the regulatory side, folks involved in making decisions and thinking carefully about setting up the right structures can do that effectively and do it in an open and transparent way, as we talk about in a number of our thought pieces. So hopefully that rounds that out.
Yeah, I think this has been great in terms of that vision and how things are shifting and maybe changing a little bit, or how they're staying the same. And I think a piece of this conversation too is the how do we get there, right? How do we get to that vision, and how has that vision changed, or that pathway changed, given the current pandemic and all the changes that's brought with it in terms of transportation. So it'd be great to hear from each of you just the key areas where you see those pathways changing. I think we've touched upon them throughout this conversation, but I think hearing from each of you around perhaps different areas would be really helpful. So, I mean, Dan, I'm going to pick on you first. I mean, from the utility perspective and even the regulatory perspective, if you want to comment on that, how is the path forward changing for utilities in terms of this electrification, greater automation and mobility? How is that going to change for utilities in terms of how they move towards that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christina. And when I think about the lenses that our clients in the utility industry are facing, the working with obviously the regulatory aspect of things, working with the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, working with the OEMs, or working with actually the end customer. When you ask the question, how will it change given what we're going through? To me, I think there's going to be an increased focus on customer engagement. Our clients are continuously looking to evolve and really get down to the core of a customer, understanding their needs. And when we look at this and balancing out what we're doing, on everything from the new programs that they roll out to working with local state regulators, working with on a national scale, to me, it's going to be even that much more important on the customer engagement side and really understanding how we can deliver expectations to a customer that now are going to evolve, right? And that to me is where it's going to really pivot towards that focus even more than before. As we have this conversation today, and as we look at all the different things, all the different stakeholders that are involved, that relationship is going to be so important for it to actually become, quite frankly, a business model that we all can live with. When you look at what's happening with the stimulus and the things that we're looking to do, and even it's interesting to see what the next phase, stimulus pack 4, 5, 6, et cetera, will bring. I do think that working with the federal side, the state, the local municipalities, with the utilities, understanding what impact that does have on rate design, understanding what impact it has on the actual programs that they roll out, and then engaging the OEM community, engaging those that are working in the infrastructure community. That to me all revolves around you and I as consumers. And I think that's where the focus is going to even be much more focused.
Yeah, I really like that around the customer engagement piece. And I mean, we see a lot of utilities working on that. And yeah, I mean, keeping customers engaged is even more important now, to make sure that utilities are addressing all those things they need to be addressing. So that's great. Sam, how about you? And maybe you can touch upon more the automaker perspective in terms of kind of how does that path forward change, towards this e-mobility vision we've been talking about.
Yeah, so as I said, over the last decade, the auto industry has they've seen the challenges. They've tried various experiments around things like V2G and second life batteries, but they've seen the challenges of trying to do that. Both from understanding the history of a particular battery pack and how you match those up. And so that's why we're starting to see some changes on the technology side. They've taken the lessons that they've learned over the decade, and they're starting to incorporate that into the designs to give them the flexibility to be able to take these battery packs, take these battery modules, and repurpose them so that they can both reduce the upfront cost for the initial vehicle, but you're also thinking upfront about, okay, once it's done in the vehicle, how can I use this? How can I work with these other partners, whether it's utilities or fleets or whoever it might be, to be able to put these to other uses? And also the same is true for the battery manufacturers, for the cell manufacturers. They're looking at models like the cell as a service, rather than selling a cell, cells to an automaker for some fixed price and then that being the end of it. They are selling it to them for a reduced price up front, but then at the end of life in the vehicle, taking that back and repurposing those for other applications. So we're seeing this flexibility and shifting of business models as they try to understand how can we get the most use out of this and generate the most benefit for the most number of stakeholders in this ecosystem.
Yeah, so it truly is something that it isn't just one group. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and the standards and how all those things work together are something that definitely have to be considered. And Derek, last but not least, your thoughts around kind of that changing path forward. I mean, what are you seeing? And perhaps maybe, building upon Sam's commentary around, all these different stakeholders having to come together. I mean, what are you seeing there in terms of that changing path?
I think something we started talking with utilities and automakers about really 3 years ago in offering forums for folks to come together and talk through some of these core issues. Like I mentioned, how does that playbook that draws from both glossaries, how does that come together? That collaboration has started. I think to Sam's point, we're going to see maybe collaboration that we haven't seen from OEMs and tier one suppliers with others in the ecosystem will be unprecedented. And I think it is uncharted territory to see more than just an automaker partnering with a charging provider to offer something like a charging network. Example with Ford and partnering with Electrify America on their network, right? For Ford Pass, similar with Nissan and EVgo. We've seen those partnerships and those kind of one-to-one across stakeholder groups in the ecosystem, look and feel like similar partnerships from the past. But seeing multiple automakers come together and collaborate around some of these bigger questions about these 5 to 10 year outlooks, I think we're going to be in for truly uncharted territory and seeing that kind of collaboration come together because it traditionally, in that fiercely competitive market, doing things on your own in more of that vertically integrated way is going to be challenged by this new fuel type that we're all talking about with e-mobility. So what that means, I think, and where a key driver for that's coming from is, to Dan's point, it's around the customer journey. That customer journey that we started off with, it's been changed through these recent events in 2020, and understanding that customer journey and being able to respond to it, pivot quickly, like we've all been talking about, is going to take some deep understanding, but also some openness and transparency that might be a little uncomfortable to markets and industries that haven't had to do that truly before. So the prediction around increased collaboration and increased transparency is definitely uncharted, and I think going to be needed.
Definitely. Excellent. Well, great. Well, I think we've had a ton of great questions come in, and I think we've actually covered a lot of them, but there were a few that were still outstanding. So I just wanted to go through a couple of them with the time we have left. And if you have questions still, definitely put them in the chat box, and we'll be taking a look at them after the webinar as well. But one question came in early on around e-bikes. And I know we've talked a lot about vehicles and heavy duty and medium duty vehicles, but there's that whole bicycle element. And I have to admit, I've wanted an e-bike. So I feel like I should pose this question. So I'm guessing maybe Sam has the best perspective around this, around electric bikes and, anything that you're seeing in that area in terms of trends and how it's going.
Yeah, actually, sales of e-bikes have been growing pretty rapidly, even before the pandemic started. And in fact, they've somewhat accelerated during this period, in part because people are, well, the operators of shared fleets have been taking them out of service because people didn't want to use shared vehicles. But I think we're gonna continue to see a lot of growth in e-bikes, e-scooters, various micro-mobility solutions. And there's going to be, I think, more of a shift, again, just as with larger vehicles, from shared options to personal use, personally owned vehicles, because it's more convenient. You don't have to worry about them being left around on sidewalks, littering sidewalks, and dealing with the charging. So I think we are going to see a lot of growth in that area over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I want an e-bike really badly, and then I realized that basically all the bikes in Denver are sold out. So I was kind of disappointed. But yeah, glad to see that they're going to be around. And another question we had, and a little bit more serious here, around the danger that the U.S. will hand electrification leadership to China or Europe. So I think it'd be great to, if you have any perspectives to share around that in terms of, the US and electrification versus kind of looking at electrification more globally. Definitely would be interested in hearing perspectives around that. Dan, do you want to maybe talk about that first?
Sure. This notion of other parts of the world advancing electrification, whether it's because of the pandemic or not, I think the nature of the need and the nature of the desires for advancement and innovation is going to happen in all major segments of the world, whether it's here in North America, whether it's in Europe, or whether it's China. When I saw that question come in, my immediate reaction was, oh, this must be some sort of there's this response that's going on right now with what the executive order is from the administration on bulk power systems. And when you look at, what it's really targeting in regards to national security, I'm not sure exactly whether, this ramp up of, the U.S. is going to go down in regards to electrification leadership, and China and Europe will go up. I think that danger that someone's asking about is something that is still, left to be seen. I'd love to hear from Derek. You've had some studies done in regards to those parts of the world as well.
Sure. Yeah, and working with clients in Europe, I think it's probably arguable that the U.S. isn't the leader in electrification for mobility. I think looking at Europe, they're quite advanced, right? Countries there and actors there are quite advanced in electrification, have been demonstrating at larger scale load orchestration, and have had some significantly larger deployments. So fun debate to have. Happy to have that offline with folks. But I think it is a truly globalized industry, right, and supply chain. So what we're very much seeing, and something when I worked at the utility and on the solar side of things, is the supply ramp up from China on batteries and on vehicles is going to have some really significant cost economy impacts on battery pack prices, similar to what we saw when solar was ramping towards grid parity and China increased production, and we really saw solar start to reach some of those goals. So thinking about electric vehicles and road parity, as it were, to internal combustion engine vehicles, there's clearly a huge push coming from China. How the US and Europe make way for that and are ready to accommodate it is going to be an important test to the audience members' question about who's leading, or at least who's unlocking that demand, as we like to say, in the market. So that will be key.
Excellent. And Sam, do you have anything to add around that to close things out?
Just, China has been the leader in terms of EV sales for most of the past several years, and will probably continue to be, just because they have the largest overall market, and policymakers in China as well as in Europe are really pushing for electrification much more strongly than we are at a federal level here in the U.S. State level, California and other states are pushing it, but I think we are going to see continued progress even here. We're going to see a lot more growth of electrified vehicles here, and there's a lot of new battery plants being constructed here, Europe, and China. So I think we're going to be in pretty good shape overall, I think.
Excellent. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. We had so many good questions come in. Definitely appreciate all the audience engagement here, and thank you so much to our panelists. This is a fascinating conversation. I mean, there's so many different directions that e-mobility can go in, and it was great to hear your thoughts around where things were heading and how the path is going to change. But from what I hear, it sounds like it's definitely a promising space, and there's going to be a lot going on in the next several years. All right. Well, great. Well, that wraps up our conversation for today. I even got an e-bike recommendation of the type of e-bike I should buy. So I'm pretty excited to look that up after this webinar. But this concludes this webinar. We do have some exciting topics coming up in future infrastructure resilience webinars, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much, and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
All right.